Greetings and welcome to IDthefuture. I'm Casey Luskin, broadcasting with Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle, Washington. We have on the show with us today Dr. Wolf-Ekkehard Lönnig, a geneticist who recently retired from the Max Planck Institute for Plant Breeding Research in Germany. And he published an article on the evolution of dogs, and it's an article which has been updated as recent as January 2013. And although this article is in German, I think that there are many English quotations which will be of interest to IDthefuture listeners because they talk about problems inherent in the claim that dogs somehow demonstrate some kind of macroevolution, or that organisms can evolve from one type into a fundamentally different type. Now, you can find Dr. Lönnig's article on his website, www.Lönnig, that's spelled WELOENNIG.de. So let me say that again. It's www.WELOENNIG.de. And I encourage our listeners to go there, and even though the article is in German, check it out and you can read a lot of the interesting quotations about the so-called evolution of dogs and how this doesn't really support Darwinian theory. So with that, Dr. Lönnig, it's really great to have you on the podcast with us today to talk about your article on the evolution of dogs.
Yes, thank you for inviting me, and great to be with you, Casey.
Well, let's just jump right into this. Who are some of the Darwinian evolutionists who have commented on the evolution of dog races and forwarded this as some kind of a microevolution within species as a proof for macroevolution?
Just before I answer that question, I would like to point out, to avoid any misunderstandings, that I myself am a dog enthusiast. I like dogs, and my family has had dogs for about 30 years now. So, your question. I will not name the German authors, because most of them are simply unknown in the English-speaking world. But I will want to mention authors which are well known. It is, of course, Richard Dawkins, who now for decades has pointed out that the differences between the different dog races are proof of macroevolution. And there is Coyne, there is Weiner, there is Prothero, and Pringle, 2011, and many other English authors. They all are of the opinion that the differences between dog races and their ancestors, the wolf, prove macroevolution.
Now, how old is this argument?
Interestingly, this is not a new argument. It was already mentioned by Saint-Hilaire, the great French zoologist, in 1837. So that is really not a new argument. It was also mentioned by Swiss zoologist Konrad Keller in 1902. And several others. The famous zoologist Richard Goldschmidt has mentioned it in 1940. So it is more than 150 years old.
So how exactly do neo-Darwinians like Dawkins justify their views, and what exactly are their arguments?
Well, Dawkins, for example, who has now forwarded this example as one of his prime examples. He even speaks of the primrose path to macroevolution. Well, this is an interesting formulation, because to consider the original meaning of Shakespeare means something different from that what Richard Dawkins meant. But what he says is this. Well, it's not a direct quotation, but the sense of what he says. There are enormous differences, and this is correct. And he mentions the differences from wolf to chihuahua, difference between Peaky and the Pie Dog, and others. And then, directly quote, if so much evolutionary change can be achieved in just a few centuries, or even decades, just think what might be achieved in 10 or 100 million years. Again, Richard Dawkins, direct quote, bear in mind this order of evolutionary change, and then extrapolate backwards 20,000 times as far into the past. It becomes rather easy to accept that evolution could accomplish the amount of change that it took to transform a fish into a human. So he takes that example, the differences between wolf and chihuahua and others, as a good proof to imagine a transformation of a fish into a human.
So why do you think these arguments are totally wrong? So, for example, what is really happening in dog evolution on the genetic and organismal levels?
It is correct. There are enormous differences. The enormous difference of quantity. They usually totally miss the enormous differences in quality. They don't take into account the direction of the changes from wolf to chihuahua. It is almost always losses of function, deterioration of integration on the genetic and anatomical levels. And we will talk about some of the examples soon.
And Dr. Lönnig, can you enumerate several examples for losses of functions on the genetic or organismal levels in dogs?
Yes. Now, perhaps the most widely known example are dogs with white fur. What is white fur? Well, it's a loss of function mutation, and the dogs with white fur are unable to produce melanin, which is necessary to produce color in the fur. For example, hairless dogs. Well, these hairless dogs not only are hairless, but the feature of hairlessness is associated with dental abnormalities. The premolars are totally missing, and often also the fangs and the incisors. Canine ectodermal dysplasia. Similar things can also happen in mice and men. And these are also very interesting and well-known examples of losses of genetical and anatomical functions. And such losses cannot be quoted as proof for macroevolution from fish to humans because, as everybody understands, a chihuahua is less than a wolf, but a human being is more than a fish. So these losses of function cannot be quoted for a transformation due to gains of entirely new genetical, anatomical, and other functions. So there could be many other things could be quoted. Blue eyes is also a reduction of melanin production. But small dogs is a special topic of its own. It is insulin-like growth factor, the one which has been found an allele. And, of course, a little dog is not, of course, an evolution of a wolf to something better, something larger, and something more integrated and functional. In this PDF paper, I've quoted and discussed many further such examples. So generally, it is important to note that it is almost always losses of functions, deterioration of integration on the genetic and anatomical levels. And these losses of functions are now quoted as proof for macroevolution from fish to humans by Richard Dawkins and others.
So what about the well-known example of the Dachshund? What has happened on the genetic and organismal level there, Dr. Lönnig?
That is achondroplasia. Achondroplasia is a hereditary disease in which bone growth by production and ossification of cartilage at the epiphysis of the long bones is retarded, and which is result in a form of dwarfism, with short limbs, a normal trunk, and a small face. This is a quotation from the Oxford Dictionary. So it's a hereditary disease in which bone grows by production and ossification of cartilage at the epiphysis of the long bones is retarded. Well, it is also caused in human beings. And, well, there's, of course, again, enormous differences in quantity. But now look at the health disorders of it. And this would be a special topic of its own. I should say that on the genetic level, this is not simply a loss of function, but it is a retro gene of about 5,000 base pairs has been integrated in chromosome number 18, which is disturbing normal bone and leg development. One of the groups now working on the questions, they speak of, for example, Parker et al., 2009, they speak of short-limbed or disproportionate dwarfism. Ostrander and Bustamante, 2012, speak of disproportionately short legs. And more than 20 dog breeds have that feature, and also it is due to the FGF4 transcript, This is the fibroblast growth factor number 4, which is causing probably an inappropriate activation of one or more of the fibroblast growth factors receptors, such as FGFR3. The important point is, I'm quoting now from another source, in normal figures, FGFR3 has a negative regulatory effect on bone growth. In achondroplasia, the mutated form of the receptor is constitutively active, and this leads to severely shortened bones. This is in human beings. To put it very simply, this negative regulatory effect on bone growth means that if the bones are long enough, the bone growth is put to rest. But if that factor, which has been found in 20 or more dog breeds, the FGF4, cause very probably inappropriate activation. And so there's a premature stop of the normal growth of the bones. And so the bones are shorter than normal. This is different from human beings. The human beings, there's directly the FGFR3 is mutated in most cases, but in dogs, it is the FGF4 gene, which is copied back from RNA by reverse transcription and is integrated in the dog genome of these more than 20 dog breeds and dachshund, so the normal growth prematurely stops.
And Dr. Lönnig, what about the large dog races like the Irish Wolfhound or the Great Dane or the St. Bernard? Would you say that there are also losses of function involved in the origin of those races? And if so, why are they larger than wolves?
Yes, before I answer that question, I would like to point out that gigantism can also happen in human beings. The largest human being which has been measured during the last century or so is Robert Wadlow with 2.7 meters height. And the largest human being living now is Sultan Kösen with roughly 2.5 meters. So, interestingly, most of these examples in human beings are due to effect of hormones. It is somatotropin which is involved in the cases I have just mentioned. But these are non-hereditary adenomata. But there are also heritable forms of gigantism in man. For example, Chahal et al. Have described in 2011 a C2A mutation in the aryl hydrocarbon interacting protein gene AIP, resulting in a premature stop codon, resulting in a truncated protein with a loss of the final 26 amino acids. The point I would like to stress here is due to a loss of 26 amino acids in an important gene, this gigantism, also called acromegaly, is to be explained. As to the dogs, one is not entirely sure now. There's no genes which have been identified, which you could say this is a gene most important for the St. Bernard or for the Irish Wolfhound or Great Dane. But if you look at these large dog races, you find that they have many defects. For example, if you cross the Great Dane with the St. Bernard, 5 months after birth, they show excessive skin growth, and in many cases display hydrocephalus. After 3 months of age, strange paralysis of the hind extremity occurs, and the Great Dane, for example, often also quoted by many evolutionists, they have a poor semen quality often. There are certain kinds of cancer. Bone cancer, for example, occurs 200 times more often than in smaller pedigree breeds, like Cocker and Dachshund. In the Great Dane, the teeth are considerably smaller and less complicated is the cusp pattern as compared to the wolf. The bony case of the eardrum is considerably smaller than in the wolf. This is the Great Dane. Then there's reduction of brain size and the brain structures. The Great Dane often have heart problems as compared to the wolf. And there are many breed dispositions, these in dogs and cats, an entire book by Gowan Thomas, 2010. Foreman et al., 2012, wrote, "The domestic dog segregates more naturally occurring diseases and phenotypic variation than any other species. So important is also the age of these so-called large dogs. St. Bernard has an average age of 7 years. The Great Dane, more than 91% don't reach an age of 10 years. Many of them don't even reach 5 years. But a normal, healthy wolf can reach in captivity about 20 years. So the age of these large dog species is strongly reduced. They also have heart problems, which would be a special topic of its own. So this is not an example where you can say it is macroevolution has occurred from wolf to a greater species. But these large dogs have so many backdraws in health and age that very probably also loss of functions in comparison to the ancestors of wolves. I mentioned in the beginning to answer your question, that it is a loss of the final 26 amino acids, the important gene, which is the main factor in a habitable form of gigantism in humans. So I would expect that something similar is also occurring, well, not that gene exactly, but losses of function also involved in the production of these so-called larger races. I've also looked in the internet for the difference between the largest wolves and the large races of dogs is not as great as often surmised.
We can see just how much they vary by looking under their skin, at their skulls.
So we've got a fantastic array of skulls from different breeds, and you can see that when we look at where they all started, which is our wolf, and if I show you in comparison a Labrador, one of the most remarkable things is how similar they are. Strip away the flesh and get down to the bare bones, what we've got is basically a small wolf.
I'm Casey Luskin, again having Dr. Wolf-Ekkehard Lönnig on our show, IDthefuture, discussing the latest in intelligent design. And today we're going to talk about whether or not dogs could have evolved through Darwinian evolution. Dr. Lönnig, of course, was recently on the show. He's a geneticist who recently retired from the Max Planck Institute for Plant Breeding Research in Germany, and he published an article on his website about the evolution of dogs. So, Dr. Lönnig, we're really glad to have you back on the show again.
It's great to be with you.
So let's get back into this discussion of dogs. As we discussed in the first podcast, Darwin apologists like Richard Dawkins and many others have long cited the differences between the races of dogs as an argument for macroevolution. Now, in the previous podcast, Dr. Lönnig, you discussed how many of these differences between dog breeds and the ancestral wolf are due to loss of function or genetic degeneration and or lead to breeds that have weird defects and diseases that could never survive in the wild. So I'd like to discuss these ideas further by getting into one of everyone's favorite dog breeds, or at least maybe Paris Hilton's favorite dog breed, the Chihuahua. I mean, I think everybody knows the Chihuahua. Doesn't the Chihuahua display an enormous set of differences between itself and the wolf? And could these be evidence for macroevolution?
Of course, there are enormous differences. And again, all these evolutionists, which I have quoted or mentioned at the beginning, miss again the difference in quality. Well, look more closely at a Chihuahua. And there's an entire chapter about health disorders. The first sentence in the internet about health disorders is, this breed requires expert veterinary attention in areas such as birthing and dental care. Chihuahuas have molars, or a soft spot in their skull, and they are the only breed of dog to be born with an incomplete skull. Now imagine a wolf born with an incomplete skull. What would be his survival value in the wild? Chihuahuas also have risk for hypoglycemia, a low blood sugar, which is especially dangerous in puppies. Chihuahuas are prone to infection of the eye and eye injury due to their large, round, protruding eyes and their relatively low ground clearance. Collapsed trachea is a health concern that is characteristic of the Chihuahua breed. They are sometimes tricky eaters, and care must be taken to provide them with adequate nutrition. Imagine a wolf with such problems. Chihuahuas have notorious problems with dental issues. Chihuahuas also are known for the genetic condition called luxating patella, but this can also cause many other dogs. Well, Chihuahuas are also prone to some heart-related disorders, such as heart murmurs and pulmonic stenosis. I'm always quoting from that article. Chihuahuas, along with other miniature dogs, such as Chinese cresteds, are prone to physical deformities. Now I may ask our listeners, well, a wolf born with an incomplete skull, displaying a tendency to hydrocephalus, being at risk of hypoglycemia, a wolf with a collapsed trachea, and being prone to some heart-related disorders and physical deformities. A wolf with a mouth so small that the teeth are overcrowded and for which dental care would be a must. Well, I think Wang and Tedford are correct when they say, quote, these various traits, they speak of the normal variation in dogs, not only of Chihuahuas, these various traits have no survival value and would have been quickly eliminated if they were to occur naturally. I would like to quote Dawkins now with some revisions again and some additions. Dawkins said, bear in mind this order of change due to a series of genetic and anatomical dysfunctions. And Dawkins again, and then extrapolate backwards 20,000 times as far into the past. And Dawkins continues, it becomes rather easy to accept that evolution, he said, from a fish into a human would be not a difficult thing. Quote him again, it becomes rather easy to accept that evolution and now the correct inferences from a fish into a human has never happened at all. This would be a possibility on the basis of the argumentation of Richard Dawkins concerning the dogs.
So, Dr. Lönnig, how does recessivity imply losses of gene function?
First, I would say that many of these differences of the dogs compared to the wolf are due to recessivity. And there are also some dominant, we will speak about that later. The important point is, I'm quoting now James D. Watson on this question. The recessive phenotype often results from the failure of mutant genes to produce any functional enzyme. Recessivity is generally due to the loss of a function on the gene and enzyme level. We have already mentioned the Dachshund, or Dachshund as we say in German. This is dominant, but is this a better, a new function for a wolf in the wild? A wolf in the wild with drooping ears and such short legs would probably have no survival value in the wild. And now look at Shar-Pei. There's also a 16.1 kb duplication, and he is prone to a Shar-Pei fever. And there are many points which could be mentioned concerning this topic alone. The Rhodesian Ridgeback, also well-known race of the dogs, it has a 133 kb duplication, and it often has a dermoid sinus, meaning a tubular indentation of the skin with hair and keratin in the lumen. And it has also an entire PhD thesis about the Ridgeback, and showing the diseases that can be associated with this duplication. On that internet page, I quoted a list of duplications with a disadvantage for human beings and also a disadvantage for dogs. So duplications do not mean automatically that it is something better, something that is more highly integrated, something that functions in a more selectively advantageous way.
So to what extent is inbreeding involved in the origin of dog races?
Yes, this is a very important point. The dogs have been bred often for some extraordinary features. And when you have such an extraordinary feature due to some loss of function or some disturbing gene duplication, if you want to breed it true and you want to have a new dog raised with that new feature, you have to do, of course, inbreeding, not to lose that feature again. So inbreeding is important in the origin of the dog races. And you know, of course, that inbreeding can mean that if you have semi-lethal or disadvantageous genes, then some features due to disadvantageous genes can be found in the progeny of these races. And that's probably one of the important reasons that domestic dogs segregate more naturally occurring diseases than any other species.
And Dr. Lönnig, you mentioned Eberhard Trommler, who is one of the fathers of cynology, the study of canines in German-speaking countries. What does he say about mutations in dogs and other domestic animals?
Well, he's one of the fathers of cynology, canine science, and he says directly and unmistakably, all mutations known to us up to now are nothing else but mistakes of nature if we take the original wild type as the yardstick for the domestic animal. And I think that he is essentially correct. All the features, the phenotypically features, which can be clearly described and which are important for distinguishing the dog races, are exactly these mutations which have the quality Eberhard Trommler has mentioned.
And Dr. Lönnig, what about gene copy number variants? Do the gene copy number variants and single nucleotide polymorphisms in dogs prove that macroevolution is occurring in the descendants of the wolf?
Well, the answer is quite short. There are no new genes, no entirely new functional DNA sequences, no higher functional integration is gained. So this cannot be argued as a proof for macroevolution.
And are there recent experimental examples of wild-type forms that can produce large variation due to losses of functions in a very short time?
Think of mutation breeding. The collection of mutants in the plant world, well, one hoped that recombination breeding would be substituted by mutation breeding, but this was not successful. Starting from a almost homozygous population of plants, and you can use mutagenic agents of different kinds, and enormous amount of variation has been produced. I myself have done it for 2 plant species, and I've worked with 2 further plant species. There was a rather homozygous P line and other lines, and you have an enormous amount of phenotypic differences, 99% due to losses of functions. In annual plants, this can happen in just a few years. For example, dwarf. How many dwarfs? I do not know how many I have isolated on the experimental fields due to mutations. But when you sequence these things, it's normally losses of functions. And this can be compared in certain aspects to the dwarfs, which have arisen from the wolf and which we now like to have as pet animals.
Now, why is the origin of dog races by large mutations in reality problematic for the neo-Darwinian perspective if all mutations were quote-unquote positive?
Even if all these mutations were positive mutations, gain of functions in the sense of new DNA structures, new DNA sequences with functional significance, higher integration, and so on, it would be still problematic for neo-Darwinism, because it was Darwin himself who said, natural selection can act only by taking advantage of slight successive variations. And he added, as a direct quote, Darwin, he said, she, nature, can never take a leap, but must advance by the shortest and slowest steps. And it was Stephen Jay Gould who has worked on that point. It is Ernst Mayr who says it is essentially the mutations with slight or even invisible effects on the phenotype which are important for evolution. And all these saltations are an exception which are not relevant for macroevolution. He was always polemically denying saltationism. And there are several reasons for that. The important point is neo-Darwinism works with slight successive variations, the selection of slight successive variations, not macromutations. And all these, or almost all these big differences between wolves and the different dog races, from wolf to Chihuahua and Piki and what have you, are due to macromutations. So this is very strange that they are now polemics against macromutations for more than 1.5 centuries at least, and now they quote macromutations that prove for macroevolution, and these macromutations are usually due to losses of functions or disturbance of a normal development. And both cannot be really quoted and could not give an argument for macroevolution.
Dr. Lönnig, this is a question that I've always been interested in myself, but how does a comparison of the placental wolf with the marsupial wolf show the improbability of the origin of species by mutation and selection?
I'm quoting now from the book of Meyer et al., Explore Evolution, and they put it very clearly and concisely. These two different groups of wolves have independently evolved from a common ancestor. And if you compare these groups, there are many really astonishing similarities. You find a figure in that PDF paper of the skull, for example, and many other features, down to very minute features. They are very similar. And all these features are thought to have come about independently of each other. The marsupial wolf is thought to have gained these features independently of the placental wolf. Now quoting Meyer et al. 2007 from their book Macroevolution, Convergence is a deeply intriguing mystery, given how complex some of the structures are. And they are really complex if you compare the marsupial with the placental wolf. And they continue, some scientists are skeptical that an undirected process like natural selection and mutation would have stumbled upon the same complex structure many different times. So it is not only the same complex structure many different times, it is a series of complex structures which natural selection and mutations would have stumbled upon. Well, this is really very improbable. I think this is one of the most improbable things, to believe that independent mutations and selection have produced an animal which is so similar to the placental wolf within the marsupial group of animals.
Okay, Dr. Lönnig, well, this is the last question for the podcast here, but given these examples, could you please compare neo-Darwinism and intelligent design concerning the origin of basic types of animals and explain why you are of the opinion that ID is a valid science belonging within biology?
I would first refer the listener to your positive testable case for intelligent design by Casey Luskin 2006 and 2011. And of course, to also give a more than a reference, I would say, if you compare these two groups, the placental wolf with the marsupial wolf, there are so many features showing specified complexity. There's an enormous amount of specified complexity. And also, very probably, also an enormous amount of irreducible complexity involved in the production of the placental wolf and the marsupial wolf. That, in my view, only intelligent design can adequately explain this amount of complex features of these two animal groups.
Well, Dr. Lönnig, we really appreciate you showing us why dogs do not make for a very good argument for Darwinian macroevolution. And I want to remind that Dr. Lönnig's article on this issue is available on his personal website. That's www.welonnig, that's WELONNIG.de. So that's www.welonnig.de. And you can, of course, find a lot more information about this issue in Dr. Lönnig's article. Dr. Lönnig, we're running out of time here, so I just want to say thank you for your wonderful work and for explaining to us why dogs, rather than providing an argument for macroevolution, provide an argument for intelligent design. I'm Casey Luskin. Thanks for listening to ID the Future.
This program was recorded by Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. ID the Future is copyright Discovery Institute. For more information, visit www.intelligentdesign.org or www.idthefuture.com.